Now it is time to open this keynote session. And I'm very happy to introduce our keynote today, Dr. Allyson Hadwin from University of Victoria, Canada. Allyson is an associate professor in educational psychology at the University of Victoria and co-director of the Technology Integration and Evaluation Research Lab. Her strong research on metacognition and self-regulation has made us to understand how learners adapt in the face of new challenges when they work alone or on teams. Her model of self-regulated learning, Biennial Hadwin 1998, has framed her work, but she has progressed the field, focusing especially on the social aspect of self-regulated learning, as well as ways technologies can support these processes. She has published extensively in the top journals. Anything Allyson publishes is scientifically rigorous, but also practically meaningful to help people to learn better. She is a successful mentor for her students. At this year, Allyson was awarded the Canadian Committee of Graduate Students in Education Mentorship Award. As a person, Allyson is a great collaborator, an excellent company, who is always eager to new adventures in every aspect of life. The title of Allyson's talk today is Promoting Adaptive Regulation, Progress, Challenges and Possibilities. Dear Allyson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanna. It's moments like this that I feel very grateful that I teach in a large lecture hall every day or every week, because this would look quite daunting otherwise. I'd like to thank you for the honor of being invited to speak today. I actually attended my first EARLI conference in Budapest 10 years ago. My MA supervisor, John Kirby, and my PhD supervisor, Phil Winnie, had both attended for many years, and I was curious about the conference. I am so glad that I joined, and I can honestly say that since that time, EARLI has become my academic home. I'm continually inspired by the level of scholarly work, dialogue, and questioning that occurs in this association. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I want to start by acknowledging my granting agency and my collaborators, and I thought rather than listing off what I have on the slide, I'd start with a little story, and it's a story about collaboration. Years ago, during my PhD, Phil Winnie came back from a visit to Finland where he'd been invited to be an opponent for a doctoral dissertation. Beyond the exciting experience itself, he emphasized that I really needed to meet the candidate. I think he said, "I think you'd really like each other's work." Well, I was busy finishing off my PhD and I moved off to my first academic position and forgot all about it. Anyone who knows Phil knows that he's patient, but he's also persistent. Years later, after I had taken my second position and moved back to the West Coast to Victoria, I received a phone call from Phil. He said he had a doctoral student visiting from Finland, and he was sending her over to visit our team in Victoria. I believe he said something like this to her: "You should go visit Allyson. She likes talking about that collaboration stuff." That doctoral student was Hanna Jarvanoja, and her supervisor was Sanna Järvelä, the doctoral student Phil had encouraged me to connect with years before. Within an hour of our meeting, we discovered converging conceptualizations of regulation and collaboration and exciting connections between our programs of research. And that was the start of a long-term international collaboration between the LET and the Thai research teams that's contributed to many of the theoretical and empirical advancements that I'll snapshot today. We're also told that it has resulted in coordinating wardrobes. So I think today's our first coordinating wardrobe for you. There's little doubt that the workplace of the future will be dramatically different than today. There's global consensus that a new set of critical competencies will be essential to prepare future generations for a rapidly changing world. These sets of 21st century skills and competencies are produced by a number of organizations and differ slightly country to country, organization to organization, but they carry 2 or 3 core competencies that are consistent when you look globally and across organizations. Those are, first, the ability to adapt to new situations and challenges, the ability to communicate and collaborate productively and proficiently in globally distributed teams, and the ability to take initiative to set goals and direct one's own lifelong learning. Those competencies are central to the research on self-regulated learning and regulation in general, and they're the topic of my presentation today. I've organized my talk in 3 main sections. What is regulation? I'll then highlight some of our contributions to research on regulation, and then I'll close with talking a little bit about future directions, challenges, and possibilities. So to begin, what do I mean when I say regulated learning? And I'm going to start with self-regulated learning with the definition broadened slightly. Overall, contemporary perspectives view regulated learning as a complex, cyclical, metacognitive, and social process that involves strategic adaptation of a number of things, including thought, motivation, emotion, and behavior. Important to this definition is a recognition that regulation is proactive, that it's responsive, that it's deliberate, that it involves cycles or processes including planning, monitoring, evaluating, and adapting, and that the targets of that monitoring and adapting can include multiple facets, is the language that we use. So cognition, behavior, motivation, and emotions can all be strategically adapted in order to better succeed in a given situation. I focus heavily or draw heavily on our model of self-regulated learning, so I'll introduce that briefly and then show how we've continued our research using this model. So we emphasize 4 cyclical and weekly sequence phases of learning. And by that, what I mean is that although all of these things are involved, learners don't always follow them in order. An example would be when you're working on a task that you think you understand and you realize something's wrong, that might invite you to go back and actually more intentionally develop more accurate or more complete perceptions of the task. So the phases are task perceptions, wherein which learners construct interpretations of the task conditions, of the context wherein which they work, and of the target outcomes of the task. They then draw on those task perceptions to set goals and to make plans to strategically approach the task. They build on those goals, those directions, those standards that they've set for themselves to engage in the task work, drawing flexibly on a range of cognitive, socio-emotional, behavioral, motivational strategies as needed. And finally, self-regulating learners are able to flexibly respond to what they find out through monitoring and evaluation in order to make either small-scale or large-scale changes in their studying. A small-scale change would be something in this moment, in this current regulatory cycle. So it might invite me to go back, like I described earlier, and improve my task perceptions or look back at the task to see if I was missing something. But learners who self-regulate learning also build on their histories. So what happened in this moment and in this task is carried forward to help inform and help me to be more strategic in future tasks and situations. And that's the large-scale adaptation. The COPE's cognitive architecture is a mechanism operating within phases of regulation. Our COPE's topology places cognition and metacognition as central to self-regulated learning, recognizing that people make strategic and intentional decisions for learning based on what they know and observe about themselves, the domain, their performance, feelings they experience, and interactions with others. Those conditions, operations, products, evaluations, and standards are continually refined and updated as mechanisms within phases of regulation as opposed to targets of regulation itself. Self-perceptions of motivation, emotion, behavior, and cognition are essential for understanding regulation and for interpreting or understanding observed traces or patterns and determining whether they represent adaptive or maladaptive regulation. So what do I mean when I say regulation is adaptive? There are 6 main points that I want to make here, and I think there are fundamental underlying assumptions in the rest of the work that I'll present today. The first is that adaptive assumes that that people exercise human agency. So individuals and teams have the capacity to make choices, and they have the capacity to impose those choices on the task, on the situation in which they work, and on others. And when you think of this underlying assumption, it means that learners' intent really matters, and we need to know something about their intent. Regulation also involves cyclical adaptation. By that I mean it's not a state or an outcome that we can measure at one point in time, but that time and temporal contingencies matter. It's socio-historical in nature. Learners bring complex beliefs and history to situations, and those histories and experiences shape their regulatory processes and the products of regulation. From this perspective, learner perceptions of themselves and the context really matter as much as the traces of what they do and the activity itself. Regulation is responsive and timely, so it's toggled on and off as needed. Some people talk a bit about this as regulation going kind of underground when it's not important. But what happens is that successfully regulating learners are able to toggle the regulation on in strategic ways when it's needed. And so in many ways, understanding or studying regulation means figuring out what where those critical situations are, or those opportunities in which someone needs to exercise regulation by making some strategic changes or engaging in those processes more explicitly. Most researchers recognize that regulation is multifaceted. It involves an interplay between metacognition, motivation, cognition, and behavior. And finally, it's socially situated in that regulation is both stimulated and constrained by cultural milieu, relationships, interactions, contexts, the tools students have available to them, and the kinds of activities that we structure for them. I'm going to speak about our contributions to date in 4 or 5 key areas. The first is regarding how we've conceptualized social modes of regulation, drawing on this model or theory. The second is I'm going to snapshot a little bit about the innovative measures that we've been experimenting with for leveraging self-perceptions and understanding regulation. And I'll point to a few of those and then just pull out a couple of critical examples that will make some of the findings and data that I'll show a little bit easier to contextualize. I'm then going to talk about our most recent grant project that's coming to its end now, which is focused on supporting planning and regulation. And I'll talk a little bit about why planning as opposed to the other aspects of regulation. And then finally, I'll give a little bit of a snapshot of the work we've been doing in researching emotion regulation, particularly in collaborative contexts, because I think that will help to illustrate how we leverage the model model of regulation to understand motivational and emotional factors as well. So I'll start with conceptualizing social modes of regulation. Our perspective of regulation recognizes that there are, or identifies, at least 3 critical modes of regulation that contribute to successful collaboration. And those include self-regulation, shared regulation, co-regulation, and each of these things work interdependently in order to shape collaborative success. When we're talking about collaboration or regulation in the context of a collaborative task, we emphasize that these modes of regulation work together in the service of the joint task at hand. So I'll try to explain each of these and contrast them separately. When we refer to self-regulation in collaboration, we're really emphasizing that it's the individual, that a critical aspect of collaboration is that each individual takes responsibility for regulating their own learning within the joint task. Self-regulation is deeply metacognitive from this perspective, in that monitoring and evaluation are driving small-scale adaptation. It's agentic in that personal goals and perceptions serve as standards for monitoring and evaluating. And it's socio-historically and contextually situated in that self-regulated learning shapes and is shaped by personal and group-based beliefs and experiences in the environment, and that those evolve over the course of collaborating as well. And I should highlight that the definitions and explanations that I'm providing of these modes of regulation have been highlighted in a recent chapter in the Handbook of Self-Regulated Learning and Performance, of which Sana and I and Mary L. Miller co-authored. So there's a little bit more elaboration in that chapter. When we refer to shared regulation, we refer to members of a group jointly regulating their joint learning through negotiation and transactive regulation. From this perspective, group members jointly negotiate and transactively engage in deliberate and strategic planning and acting, reflecting and adapting, and they do that by controlling collective behavior, cognition, motivation, and emotion as needed. Socially shared regulation is transactive, and by that I mean multiple individual perspectives contribute to joint metacognitive, cognitive, behavioral, and motivational states and processes. It's deeply metacognitive in that monitoring and evaluation are shared amongst people and drive negotiated large and small scale adaptation. And it's collectively agentic in that joint goals and standards are intentionally adopted, informed by, but not necessarily replacing individual goals and standards. And those are used for monitoring and evaluating together. And it's socio-historically and contextually situated as well, in that individual and collective beliefs and experiences come together to create a shared set of conditions that continually shape and are being shaped by the joint activity together, or joint engagement. Co-regulation, and I'm going to emphasize this as a kind of new, I call it a new old version of co-regulation. I want to acknowledge that our conceptualizations of co-regulation have evolved, and in many ways they've reconnected with the sociocultural roots of this concept, originally introduced by Mary McCaslin and operationalized in my much earlier empirical work in this area. I'm going to come back to this a little bit more over the course of the presentation, but I thought it would be helpful. I wanted to recognize that co-regulatory affordances, such as regulatory prompts in discussion, are taken up not only by individuals, so thereby shaping self-regulated learning, but are also taken up by groups, thereby shaping the development of socially shared regulation. I think this perspective accounts for two salient problems in the field. The first is some conceptual confusions, particularly between co-regulation and prompts. By that I mean prompts and evidence of prompts are often taken to be evidence of co-regulation, and what we actually theorize is it's not the prompt itself or the existence of it, but the way it's taken up by the individual or the group. It also accounts for some overlap and difficulties we have empirically teasing apart co-regulation and socially shared regulation. And an example from our team is that we've consistently over studies in the last 4 or 5 years, had difficulty achieving high inter-rater reliability when we code for co-regulated learning. And I know other people have also commented on this at conferences over the last few years. And I think what happens is to cope with that difficulty, what we often do is reduce co-regulation to the prompts because they're really easy to identify and it's very easy to get inter-rater reliability when we're looking at the prompts themselves. And instead what we need to be doing is looking at those in the context of the shifting and the type of regulation that is shaped. When we did that, when we pulled out our places where we had trouble achieving inter-rater reliability on co-regulation, we realized that they were often the situations where there was some sort of prompt that looked like co-regulation, but it either wasn't picked up or used in any obvious or meaningful way to inform self-regulation or shared regulation, or they were instances where we were coding it as shared regulation and not co-regulation. So we were missing that there was a process that was shifting that shared regulation. Our contributions to date, I think, cover these 4 main areas. So I'm going to now speak a little bit about the innovative measures that we've been using to study self-regulation, and they draw heavily on self-perceptions in that we've been particularly interested in the strategic decisions people make based on what they think and believe about what they are doing. I'm going to acknowledge right up front that our data collection is often quite messy. We collect data in authentic learning environments, often over the course of a semester or a series of activities in grade-based courses where what students are doing matters. And so most of our data collection tools serve 2 purposes. The first is that they collect data about regulation in situ as students are making sense of things and as that changes over the course of a semester. But at the same time, that the data or the tools that we use to collect data, we acknowledge are also stimulating metacognitive awareness in some way. So they act as an intervention or a co-regulatory support in many ways, as well as an opportunity to collect data. And that's a confound and it's messy, but it's one that we've been willing to live with. I'm not going to go through each of the types of self-report instruments that we've been using. They're all described in our published work, and in particular, Sanna and Paul Kirchner, along with a number of us from our joint teams, published an article that particularly highlights the way we've used these tools for promoting and also collecting data about regulation in collaborative environments. Importantly, our self-report measures all have these key features. We have developed them with the aim of conceptualizing learner perceptions of actions, so their perceptions of what they did, with their intent, why, so in response to what challenge, what situation, their perceptions of whether or not that worked, the effectiveness. And then often we've also collected data that gets a little bit at the control or the adaptation, what they perceive they can do differently. And then we're able to kind of model these pattern contingencies over multiple cycles, often over 10 or 13 weeks. I'm going to just show two instruments that we've been using in our most recent work that are a little bit different. We call them narrative response constructors, and they are tools that are designed to support students to construct a self-narrative. In this case, the self-narrative they're constructing is about the challenges that they encountered while they were working. We use similar variations of these tools when we're studying regulation and individual work as collaborative work. We use these tools to try to reveal or contextualize strategies students perceive they use with their perceived level of success, among a number of other things. What this allows us to do is model patterns of perception contingencies and look for evidence of adaptive versus maladaptive patterns of regulation that can be mapped to trace data, for example. So here's just an example. They create a paragraph about themselves, and they have some prompts or scaffolds to do that. In this case, they had a list of 22 challenges, which roughly classify into planning, doing the task, checking, group, and teamwork strategies. That's emerged from our other work in the past when students just gave us open-ended descriptions of challenges they've encountered. So they choose from a list the main challenge that they encountered. They make a judgment about the degree to which it affected their work, and then they reflect on what they did to overcome it and whether or not it was successful. And we've also been looking at, whose responsibility was this strategy? Was it mine? Was it ours? Was it yours? We've also used similar tools when we've looked at emotion regulation. So we've used these socio-emotional sampling tools, and they vary slightly depending on when they're given, but they're designed to be a quick snapshot of what I'm feeling in the moment during collaboration. And so often we'll have them right when we get started, partway through the collaborative activity or task, and then again toward the end. And then we can see how those processes or change. So these types of tools reveal situations where emotions we classify as negative or deactivating may be perceived to serve different regulatory functions for the learner. And I think these types of tools will have great promise as we can learn how to line them up with some of the data, facial recognition data and other data that's being used to study and observe emotions as they occur in those environments. I'm now going to turn to our most recent program of research and try to give you a summary of where we are across a number of different studies. And this work is focused specifically on supporting planning and regulation. So why focus on planning? Planning sets the stage for successful regulation. Task perceptions, which are part of planning, if they're incomplete or inaccurate, make it very difficult for learners to set goals that can prompt timely and appropriate strategic response, monitoring, and evaluating. If planning is poor or perceptions are inaccurate, it can lead to poor choices of strategies or monitoring and evaluating the wrong things. And the example I like to use for this is that I work a lot with first-year undergraduate students who are struggling. And often when I look at the kinds of goals they set when they sit down to read or study for their classes, I have goals that are quantifications of the number of pages I need to get through in the next hour, rather than goals that relate to what they need to know or learn from the material itself. Often that type of goal comes from a misperception of what it is I'm supposed to be doing here. The task isn't just to get the chapter read for class, but it's to know something or learn something critical from that. The second reason that we focus on planning in our look at support tools is that teams report planning challenges quite frequently. And so in our research, we found that people anticipate planning challenges. If you ask them what they're worried about in the upcoming work with their team, they will often identify challenges like this. I'll show you a couple in a moment. But they also report planning challenges after. So they recognize that this is an area where they run into difficulty. Some examples. Students will say, we had different understandings of what we needed to do. We had different ideas about how to organize our time. We had differing standards about what was good enough in terms of this work. We had different ideas about how to start, or we had different ideas about how we should work together in this type of task. What's exciting for me as a researcher in the area of regulation is that when students can acknowledge that something causes difficulty, that it's a situation where they will run into problems, and it's a situation they expect to experience, it's a wonderful opportunity to support regulation and help them to start to explore the kinds of strategies or techniques that they might put into place in order to mitigate that type of challenge. The last point is that planning is often neglected. So our research shows that when you look at teamwork and you code interactions through text-based discussions or video-based interactions, there's very little emphasis that students put on planning. When it does happen, it's often inaccurate or it's very shallow or superficial. So it might be about assigning roles and getting started that way rather than making sense of and negotiating the kinds of directions that we want to go in or the standards that we have for the quality of the work that we are producing. So we have found that groups jump straight in with very little planning at all. They jump straight into the task, and this is well established in the literature overall. They engage in ways, they engage very few planning kinds of activities. They construct inaccurate or incomplete perceptions of the task, so it's not that they didn't need to engage in planning. They assumed everybody was on the same page, and they were not. They're often unaware of differences among members' personal interpretations until quite far on in the collaborative activity and often at the end. And they tend to engage in very shallow modes of negotiation. So when you look at the planning discussions, the best you will see is kind of a brainstorming of all the critical things, but no exchange or negotiation about that planning overall. So for that reason, we've been researching tools that might support planning and help to mitigate the kinds of challenges that students encounter with planning. And we've looked specifically at two categories of tools for supporting planning. The first is a set of scripting tools, and the scripting tools are designed, sorry, I've got to just look at my note here. The scripting tools are designed to structure collaboration by specifying, sequencing, and distributing activities and roles to be enacted. And in our case, when we use this kind of scripting, it focuses very explicitly on scripting related to planning and as a support or strategy for doing a better job of planning. We have looked at or used macro scripting and micro scripting, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a moment. The second set of support tools that we've been exploring are group awareness tools. Group awareness tools typically present some sort of graphical representation of cognitive, behavioral, or social processes to increase people's awareness or the group's awareness and prompt regulation together. And so again, we've been examining visualizations as a type of planning support with the goal of leveraging differences or diversity in individual planning as well as convergent between individuals to guide the group in more negotiation and active shared planning. I'll contextualize this by saying that we consistently use a macro script for collaboration, and our goal here is to model for students that collaborative work unfolds over some very critical stages or phases. The first is that we always have time set very specifically and activities set very specifically for individual planning and preparation. And when we work with groups over multiple tasks, we usually have some requirements about individual planning having to happen and preparation being done before we'll turn you over to your group. So we have groups that fall apart because there's people who just haven't done their work. And in our first preparations, rather than letting students regulate that, we give them a group where everybody's prepared, and then we deal with the other ones separately. I can answer questions about that later. The second phase is that we engage students in a very explicit group planning session that might be very scaffolded or it might be more open-ended. Then we give them time to work on the collaborative task work itself. Some of the work that I'll present today is a really challenging task that students have to complete in 90 minutes. Other tasks that we're looking at are things that unfold over several different work sessions. And then we always have designated point for students to reflect on the collaboration and try to make sense of it. And then to leverage that reflection and the history that they've developed together and what they've learned about collaborating to work together in the future. So it would be very unusual in our research for students to work on a second task with a different group. We try to avoid letting students fall into a belief that things will be better if they work with someone else, and that's a very common perception with undergraduate students, that if I had a different group, it would all be just fine. So our goal is to convey a growth mindset rather than to reinforce the often held belief that things would just be better if you gave me a different group or a better group or people who knew what they were doing. In the microscripting of planning, we've been comparing low support and high support conditions. And I want to highlight be very explicit about the fact that our low support condition still has support. We do not have a no support condition in our work, and that's partly because I wear two hats all the time in these contexts. I'm an instructor trying to help people become better learners and more successful at university, and at the same time I'm researching the ways that they learn to be more adaptive and strategic at university. So our low support condition gives students some broad planning questions to think about. This might be given to individuals in the individual planning phase, or it might be given to the group as a whole to discuss or negotiate. And they're broad questions like, what are we being asked to do here? Or why are we being asked to do this task? So in that way, they prompt some of the planning process, but they provide minimal explicit guidance for planning beyond think about this particular aspect. So we typically have what are we being asked to do, something about the implicit aspects of the task, so why are we being asked to do this, and then it will often have other kinds of things. The example I gave here is how should we approach this task. We've compared those types of scripts to high support. In our high support conditions, students are given closed format questions. So they're prompted both about planning process, but also the kinds of things that might be relevant for the task at hand. And in this way, it gives them a little bit more explicit guidance to guide their planning. So the example I have over here, I'll just use the first one as an example. The students are typically told to choose the best 5 items in a list. What is my group being asked to do here? And they've got a list of 10 items. 5 of them are accurate. They're very well aligned with this particular task, what they're being asked to do for the course or for the assignment. And the other 5 are what I call really good distractors. So they're the things that people often misunderstand about the task, or when we're working with subsequent collaborative tasks, they're items that relate to one of the other tasks they have to do, but not to this collaborative assignment or task itself. The first sets of studies that we did looked at whether we should script individual or group planning, and to do this we compared 4 different scripting conditions. So people received either high or low scripting at the individual level when they were pre-planning before they met with their group, and then they also received either low or high scripting to assist the group in their collaborative planning for this session. And so there's a series of conditions, and we refer to condition D as the comparison condition. That's the group that had low support in both for individual and group planning. So what have we found? Well, in our what we found is that if we provided high scripting for group planning, and again, these are the findings I'm talking about are across a number of studies, not in one itself. In those situations, we found that the students had accurate task perceptions. So if they had high scripting at the group planning, together they seemed to be able to identify what were the really relevant aspects of the task and reasons for doing it. They had more tendency to learn from differences in task perceptions amongst team members. So they actually were able to work with the fact that members of the team had different perceptions, and they demonstrated higher transactivity in their planning discussions. By that I mean they built on each other's ideas and perspectives to construct their representations of the task and throughout their planning activities. When students were given low scripting at the individual planning level, one of the key findings that we had was that they anticipated more challenges and high degrees of problems with each of the kinds of challenges before they actually collaborated. So the low scripting condition somehow prompted them to be thinking about difficulties they might encounter and the kinds of things or categories of those challenges that they anticipated were challenges enacting the task, behavioral challenges actually carrying out the work and exchange with each other, and then planning challenges themselves. And then finally, when students were given both high levels of scripting for their individual planning and their group planning, or also when they were given low levels of scripting for their individual and collaborative planning, we found that there were no advantages in terms of the quality of planning discussion, so their quality of discussion was no better than the groups that had the other scripting conditions. But the students in those groups, for some reason, reported more challenges during collaboration. So in this way, having the scripting at both individual, high scripting at both individual and group planning sessions, or not having it at all, was not very successful in mitigating challenges, so they were seeing a lot of challenges or reporting a lot of challenges at the end of their collaboration. So what do our findings suggest? At this point, the evidence that we have suggests that first, and I didn't mention this in my findings, but I will now, we saw no advantages in terms of task performance. So it didn't matter what scripting conditions students were in, they didn't perform better in the task overall. That could be the way we're coding or measuring success in the task, but it could also be a number of other things. We did see some advantage to scripting group planning, particularly in terms of changing or disrupting some of those maladaptive patterns of planning that we saw in the past. So we did notice that when we provided high scripting at the group level that they were engaging in a different kind of planning, and I think that's promising. But we also found cautions about over-scripting, giving them too much scripting in too many of those planning sessions, and also under-scripting, not giving them enough to go on or to use in that planning itself. So the next thing we did was we moved on to look at visualization. So we wanted to know if we can support students to leverage the expertise and the diversity in their individual planning when they get to the group level. So we examined 3 types of visualizations. The visualizations were all given to the groups to guide or support them in their collaborative planning processes. In the first instance, we gave no visualization. So in this case, they engaged in planning, so they had some scripting for their planning, but they didn't, when they came to group planning, have anything that pulled that together in any way for them to see. They were going on memory of their own planning and relying on each other sharing what they thought in order to inform the planning process. We then looked at quantified or frequency-based planning, and in this case, people used planning scripts to, they had the planning scripts as well, but when they came together, they saw an image that showed them both the items that people in the group had identified as being critical or important for this task, as well as the number of people who had identified each. And then the third one was a nominal planning condition. And in this case, they had the information of the items that people had chosen, but not the number of people who had chosen each one. And by the way, these images are actually, they're from the data and they were very common. So it was not uncommon for a group to come together and realize that when you put the 4 or 5 of us together collectively, we thought everything was important and relevant for this task. Then our research sort of examined the effectiveness of those visualizations for planning. And again, I'm going to summarize the kind of key findings. So the first thing, in the no visualization condition, we found higher ratings of planning challenges. We found that students were less transactive in their planning discussions, so they didn't build on what each other said and kind of co-construct that type of shared planning. That when they identified having a planning challenge, it was highly correlated with identifying or reporting other kinds of challenges as well. So there was a strong correlation if you'd had a planning challenge that you would have reported experiencing other kinds of challenges. And we found that students in the no visualization condition in the first task had a lot more words in their planning. They did a lot more talking, but they didn't do that kind of negotiation or transactive kind of talking in their planning. For the quantified frequency condition, we found that when they actually had those numbers, the number of people who identified each thing as important, it shut down their planning or constrained it almost completely. And I'll give you one example. We have many quotes like this. So Sarah says to her group, in the group summary that you click on, all 4 of us chose A. And Hayden, ours is a text-based chat, puts a question mark, not sure what she's saying. So Sarah says, that's all of our responses to the individual solo planning we did. And the third group member says, oh. So Sarah says, I think our answers are A, H, I, and J, because those are the ones with the most percentage or the most people identifying them. And Sam, the other group member, says, okay, Hayden, just put that in our answers. So they were co-constructing an answer, and Hayden was in charge of recording it for the group. And in that discussion, you can see that they didn't even talk about what the items were about. Right? They were not really engaging in planning discussion. They were just picking the top choices and putting those in. And then finally, in the nominal condition, where they knew there was what the convergence and divergence was in the amount of, or in the ideas that people identified, students identified more accurate or had more accurate task perceptions overall. The next thing we did, and I've just taken a snapshot from this data set, but we've also looked at how the visualization shape regulation of planning challenges. And so for this, we use those measures that I was showing earlier, where people identify the challenges that they perceive that they encountered, and then they identify what they did about it, whether it worked, that kind of thing. And so we were looking for patterns within and across the different conditions. The main finding we found when we looked at planning and the reporting of planning challenges alone was that the students in the no visualization support condition reported a higher probability of encountering a planning challenge. It wasn't the highest. Their highest probability of challenges that they reported were time, and that was the case for all groups. Remember, it was a timed activity, so that's not too surprising. But if they identified or indicated that they'd encountered a planning challenge, they had a high probability of choosing a planning strategy for addressing that challenge. They experienced or reported experiencing success using that for using the planning strategy for successfully addressing their planning challenges. But if they reported addressing their planning strategy with a team strategy, coordinating, and that kind of thing, they generally reported moderate to low success with that particular strategy. We also did these kinds of decision probability maps looking at all the challenges they reported and following through the conditional probabilities of taking different pathways or routes. And we've used similar methods, for instance, to compare students as their probabilities individually over time for different groups. So what did we find? Should we support group planning with visualizations of individual planning? Our evidence to date suggests that, again, there was no advantage for task performance. So across these two main areas of research, we're finding that although we can disrupt or change the quality of planning itself and the regulation within that planning stage, it's not enough to improve the performance, and it's most likely that we have to be supporting regulation in other phases of the process as well. So we found some advantage to visualizing differences or the array of responses that an individual had or beliefs an individual has in their planning. So we found that some form of visualization seems to be better than having none at all. But again, cautions about visualizations that overemphasize where the similarities are. Those were the ones where they just picked the top answers and it actually shut down their planning overall. Another area that we've really been looking at is in our work researching emotion regulation. And in this area, we've been particularly interested in how people strategically regulate motivation and emotions when they're working in collaborative tasks. So we draw on the same COPE-based model of SRL to introduce, theorize, and research motivation and emotions. And in doing so, we emphasize that self-regulation or self-regulated learning is concerned with how people operate on perceptions of their motivation and affect, rather than just on the physiological states themselves. And I'll give a little bit of an example of this. Anyone who knows me knows that I suffer from terrible performance anxiety when I have to do a public talk like this. I'm fine once I get up here, but the preparation is a struggle for me. And I have that metacognitive knowledge about myself. I know that I need to be aware of my level of anxiety, and I know that I have to be aware of the effect it's having on my construction or my preparation of a talk. I hold standards for myself that balance the amount of anxiety I can tolerate or handle with the quality and the competence of work that I'm able to produce at the same time. So last week, when my anxiety reached the point that I was creating complete cognitive chaos in my head and my self-efficacy was plummeting, after emailing Phil to acknowledge that that's what I was going through, because that's what I always do, that makes me feel better somehow, I stopped and I realized I needed to change something. I needed to toggle on some new strategies that might help me to get this under control. And I think this is important because it shows how, the example I'm going to talk through shows how the facets of regulation come together. So the anxiety was not going to go away with deep breathing and exercises that would help me to take control of my anxiety. What I needed to do was take control of the task and be able to have some ability to think in a coherent, straightforward way so that I could get the presentation moving. So I changed my slide version to slide sorter. Somehow I didn't know there was slide sorter. That was a big aha for me. I created 4 big sections with main points that I wanted to convey, and then I moved my slides around into each section. And this allowed me to just narrow down and focus on one section at a time, ignoring the rest of it and ignoring the fact that I would have a final product at some point. As I made progress in this, my motivation improved. So my self-efficacy increased, my emotional state improved in that my anxiety decreased, my behavior became more focused and productive. I wasn't putting my computer down and going shopping for new purses to avoid the problem anymore. And my cognition improved. I could think and organize my thoughts coherently and get excited about what I wanted to talk about today. So that's an example where those facets of regulation come in together and how they're informed through those COPES mechanisms. So in our work, and I'm sharing a study that was just recently published by Isha Bakhtar, who's here, and Liz Webster and I, we looked at a range of data sources in our collaborative learning environments, so chat logs, the emotion sampling scores, reflections students did, some of the information we had about their knowledge and performance coming into the task, and we use that to try to understand or model the COPES conditions for 2 different cases. A group that collectively and individually indicated that they'd had a very negative climate when they were working together, and a group that indicated a positive climate. We looked at socio-emotional utterances and found the positive climate group had more positive socio-emotional discourse overall. The negative climate group had higher negative socio-emotional discourse throughout, and that was from our coded chat discussions and exchanges. And that negative socio-emotional discourse occurred particularly in the first 15 minutes. So we use time and look at the where these types of things appear across the collaborative task itself. The positive climate group evidenced more socially shared regulation and more co-regulation, particularly in the first 30 minutes of collaboration. They engaged in more planning and orienting discussion, again, particularly in the first 30 minutes of collaboration, and this is quite consistent with some other findings that I've heard reported by other groups this week. And they also reported positive socio-emotional interactions throughout the planning period or planning process. Our findings to date about socio-emotional factors in collaborative contexts show that socio-emotional climate is influenced by incoming individual conditions, that regulation of emotions during initial planning matters, that negative emotions during interaction constrain shared adaptation when challenges are encountered, and that positive motivational statements seem to serve as some sort of effective strategy for creating a positive climate. Again, I emphasize this was based on our analysis of 2 cases, and it's something that we're expanding across our larger data set. Findings from this for these 2 groups suggest to us that it's important to support planning, that it's important to scaffold interactions and the kinds of interactions, especially socio-emotional factors in interactions, and particularly early on in the discussion, and that it's important to prompt or help students learn how to engage in positive and respectful discourse. I now want to close just by identifying what I see as some critical challenges for the field. The first is in adopting clear and consistent use of terminology. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly here. The good is that regulation is recognized as important and successful collaboration, and there's been broad uptake across disciplines, and I think that's been a big change over the last 5 to 7 years. The bad is that we've, in that process, lost some of the grounding in psychological constructs, and this is reduced to, we've been reducing the operationalization of regulation to just adaptation of or change, and losing the idea that this is also a highly metacognitive process. And the ugly is that more than 25 different terms are in use, or were in use last time I checked, to talk about these various social modes in regulation. In our chapter in the upcoming Handbook of Self-Regulated Learning, we offer a framework for categorizing the terms and the ways people have been using them under some broad categories. And oftentimes we're able to show that some of the new terms that people develop are actually just subcomponents of these main modes of regulation. The second challenge I want to highlight is that we need to move beyond a reductionist approach. Regulation is complex, and we get into trouble when we start isolating constructs or processes and trying to understand patterns just within one data stream. So often, to cope with the complexity, we do that, such as when we pull out off-task behavior and don't include it in our analysis, when in fact our research shows that some of the off-task behavior sometimes changes the socio-emotional climate. Or we examine trace data without contextualizing it in event-based self-perception data. My third challenge for the field is that we need to examine how phases of regulation, metacognitive processes, and facets of regulation work together. And these are not easy things to do, I realize that. We tend to research them separately. At the very best, we're able to identify co-occurrences between these things, but we tend not to be able to splice them together as well as we should. And I think this is going to be really important for understanding the situated contingencies and the way these processes interact and unfold over time, much like the example I gave of managing my own anxiety in the context of my talk preparation. So I think seeing these kinds of contingencies where we're able to identify a situation, what Sana refers to as a trigger moment when regulation is warranted, that we have some knowledge of the perception or intent that people have when that happens. Sometimes they don't intend to do anything about it. We have some data about the types of actions or strategies that they take. We're able to map those onto outcomes and understand what that means for the next time. And I think those contingency patterns are going to be really critical for furthering the field. The last point is that researching, we need to spend some time, and where's Jeff Green? I have to thank him for this. Hi, Jeff. We really have to spend more time researching what works and doesn't work for at-risk learners or very weak learners. And we had a really shocking, what I thought at the time was shocking realization of this when we recently analyzed some data, some learning analytics data, to understand my self-regulated learning course, why I had students falling. I had 3 modes. So I had this really low fail to C+ mode. I had this B to B+ kind of mode, and then I had these students in the higher kind of A+ end, and we were really trying to understand what's different about those modes and what's different in terms of predicting where the students end up in those modes. And what we discovered when I came into the lab and found my students had been applying all kinds of missing data techniques to deal with a bunch of missing data they had, because we had a lot of instruments over a lot of people over time, that they were trying to figure out which technique to use, and they'd asked me about this. And I immediately stopped and said, can you tell me where the missing data is coming from in the modes? And when they went back to analyze the data, it was a lot of or a high percentage of the missing data was coming from the students in the very low mode. What does that mean? Well, that means that what those students need in terms of support to more successfully regulate their learning may not be at all the kinds of things we've been teaching in our learning strategies and self-regulated learning course around setting more meaningful goals, better understanding tasks. They need to start focusing on regulating some very simple behaviors. Getting to class, opening the website for the course and assignments, and actually trying the activities. That's a really big difference, and if we try to apply our expert models for expert regulation processes to those students, we're going to continue to lose them, and I'm going to continue to have those students at the far end, and they're the students who are really at risk. I think a promising thing is that I've seen lots of exciting and emerging directions at this conference. I think work modeling regulation with multimodal and multi-channel data has great promise for us. We're seeing much more sophisticated analytic methods for modeling within student patterns of regulation. We're seeing attention to socio-emotional processes in regulation and understanding how those co-occur with other regulatory processes, and attempts to look at multiple dimensions of regulation simultaneously. So I'm really happy to see that, and I look forward to where the field will progress in the next 10 years. Kiitos, and thank you for your thoughts and questions.
Microphones here.
Is it on? Okay. That was fabulous. That was a really great talk in terms of breaking down the different aspects of your work and defining it really well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that everybody defines their world in different ways. I know some people define it in terms of self-regulation, some people in terms of cognitive load, and so we tend to shade our interpretations in that way. And I define my world in terms of strategy use, teaching strategies, skill acquisition, following, a very a different way. And you just kept coming closer and closer to how I think about the world, but never quite like, getting there. And so like even talking about moving away from reductionist principles and talking about, let's talk about things from multiple sources of information, et cetera. And even your example, when you're talking about, I calmed down and I used strategies. Yeah. And I get engaged in this behavior. Yeah. And so, our approach has been you teach students strategies, and then the less skilled students then are empowered by those strategies. If I say, because I work with some freshmen who are the lowest of the low, but don't tell them that. If I say come to class, that's not enough, but if I give them strategies and teach them strategies and have, then they can practice, then we see outcomes. So I'm just worried that if we continue to focus on planning and self-regulation and never teach them the skills that they need to perform, that we're missing something, and that it maybe if we teach them strategies, then an outcome will be that they start self-regulating. So it's just which one comes first, even though in the sequence self-regulation might seem to come first, maybe one emerges from another. And so since you kept coming almost to that point, I wanted to know what you were thinking about, how what we should do with the kids. Should we continue?
So I do teach strategies, and I came to this as a learning strategy instructor. That's why I went on to do my PhD, because I had been looking at learning strategies and discovering that they weren't always working or transferring to the degree that we wanted them to, and that's how I came to this area of self-regulated learning. I have never lost the grounding in the strategies themselves, and what I try to do is help students to understand how the strategies work, but also why they work and in what situations and conditions they work in. So from a self-regulatory perspective, I help students to build strategies that are individualized and appropriate for them and the challenges that they encounter and the tasks that they encounter them in. But I do in that, I introduce them to strategies that have received a fair amount of support in the field. It's just that I really emphasize that it's not like this, you don't use it the same way in all situations. The second thing that I would say is that the other thing that I observed, and this comes from my earlier research, which I didn't present here, is there's a real danger when students learn strategies that are intended to solve an academic problem that they're encountering, and they master a strategy that seems to work for everyone else, and that the research says should work. They put a lot of effort into that process, and it turns out the problem wasn't the strategy at all. The problem was that they didn't have an accurate understanding of what they were supposed to be doing and why. And it's very dangerous when we do that, because when a student fails in that situation, it's much harder to bring them back, because now their efficacy plummets and they think, okay, it's me. I'm not good enough to be here, when it wasn't that at all. The strategy was good, they applied the strategy well, but it didn't address the problem they were encountering. And that's why I've been really interested in these pattern contingencies about where the problem is, and then let's find the strategy that fits there. That's why I'm back at planning. So let's fix planning, and now when we work on the strategies, you're more likely to have success with those strategies, because they're addressing the right task. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Please take your chance.
I also really loved the talk. My question is about thinking about how this would generalize from collaboration in the classroom to collaboration in the workplace. Can you talk a little bit about what it would be like if I had a group with kind of unequal power dynamics, for lack of a better word? So I may think there's kind of one way to execute a plan, but my boss actually wants me to do something else. Or my teacher wants me to write a paper in a particular way that I wouldn't, and how this cycle would change.
I think the processes that we're studying and trying to understand and the kinds of supports and scaffolds that we use apply equally there. We do have some research ongoing where we're looking at regulation of collaboration in the context of engineering work, when engineers work to design in design-based environments, which are very often very open-ended and draw on really distributed expertise on the part of the team. So I think those are really interesting places to be studying regulation and collaboration, and really important areas to be doing that. But my approach to understanding those processes would be very similar. In the example that you gave, the challenge may be figuring out, how we draw on the various kinds of expertise that are here, right? That's still an opportunity to regulate. It's regulating the way the team operates together. And again, that's fine as long as we all have an accurate and shared perspective of where we're going and what we're supposed to be doing here. So it's very similar to the earlier one, right? If we work on how we interact and distribute roles based on expertise, but we never come to a shared understanding of where we're going with this, engineering design teams, computer science students who work on collaborative software design describe the same kinds of challenges, right? If they don't have the shared task awareness and task perspective, and they don't spend time constructing strong shared plans, then those other things, you can fix them, but they don't fix the problem.
So I want to collaborate. Wonderful talk, by the way.
Thanks.
I wonder if you could say more on your critiques about the expert perspective. I wonder, Joanne Lovato, Randy taught me that, boy, the learner's perspective is super, super different from the expert's perspective. And I wonder if that's where you're going or if you're going someplace else.
I think where I'm going with this is I'm worried that when we're modeling regulatory processes and what it is to strategically regulate with expert learners, we're missing some of the things that need to be regulated first before you can get to that. Does that make sense? So. Yes, yeah. I think experts are expert learners, by the way, because I think from a self-regulated learning perspective, we're regulating our learning all the time. I would not describe myself ever as a self-regulated past tense learner in any area of my life. I apply the same processes and strategies when I learn to play hockey, when I'm learning to play the piano, as I do when I'm learning to do a talk or a presentation. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I also have a question, which is a bit, I think, a clarifying question too. When you presented the study about planning, and you did not find performance differences, I was kind of surprised because that's what you actually expect. So I was wondering about, what kind of planning this really was, what kind of tasks they were working on, and how the performance measure then fitted this planning activity.
Oh, the performance measure was on the collaborative task as a whole. So I think the measures that we have about the quality of planning, the numbers of challenges, those are things that are kind of measuring the outcomes of planning themselves. They pointed to improvements. So some of the kinds of supports we were providing were actually changing and helping students to leverage those planning processes better. That was a positive thing. It was not enough, however, to change the outcome or the quality of the collaborative project that they did together, and I think it's just too far removed. I think it would be naive, although, I've complained for years that, we try to fix the strategies and the doing part, and they're not working on the right task. At the same time, if we help them to sort of engage in better planning, I don't think that remediates all the other challenges. I think that's a much stronger platform to learn how to be more strategic and how we interact and operate together during the collaboration, and in terms of producing a higher quality a piece of work that really leverages or shows co-construction of knowledge and understanding. So I just don't think it's enough on its own. So I was disappointed, but then afterwards I thought, I'd probably be more disappointed if all we had to do was fix planning. And I think there's other aspects of regulation that still need support. It's just not enough. But the fact that we can change or disrupt the planning itself and make it better is a positive sign. It's a step in the right direction. Not enough.
Thank you.
There's still time for one or two questions.
Jeff.
Sure.
So I enjoyed your talk tremendously as well, and I've been thinking a lot about what you've been saying about what I would perceive to be some of the qualitative differences between maybe some students that are struggling and some students that are performing better. And I guess what I'm wondering is if you could, and I know that you've done some of this work, can you speak a little bit about how we might get at student learning in terms of qualitative differences in how they're perceiving planning, how they're perceiving their strategy use, beyond just the quantification of qualitative data. Particularly from a situated perspective, I'd be interested in your thoughts thoughts of how we might better understand what is qualitatively different about those students.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I understand your question, Jeff, but
maybe I should keep this.
I think it's to do with the kinds of the patterns or contingencies and how they approach it, right? So I'll move away from some of the data I presented here, and one of the things that we do in our research is that we have students every week do a planner, and the planner asks them to just take control of 1 2-hour study session. Right? So they decide what it is, why they're focusing there, they set a goal for what it is they need to accomplish or know at the end, and we try to move them away from those behavioral goals like read 12 pages or to what it is they need to know. And then they reflect on what actually happens when they work on that. So what challenges they encountered, what they did about them, whether it worked or not, what they would do differently next time, and then they engage in that same sort of cycle over and over again. So instructionally there, we're trying to help students to think about themselves as self-regulating learners who are adapting and changing and building on the history that they've developed themselves. And in terms of research, that allows us then to start looking at and mapping the patterns in those cycles. So for example, I have a student who's looking at those contingencies for English language learners, particularly Chinese students, adjusting to university and comparing those to domestic students. And what she's seeing is she's looking really there within student, what are the kind of patterns over time. And then when we look at those within student patterns over time and group them for the Chinese students versus the domestic students, what's fundamentally different? And she's seeing some really different patterns in the types of strategies that they feel are working for them or that they gravitate to, and how successful those are. So.
Great, thank you.
I think it's about collecting the data over time so that you can see those patterns, and that's whether those patterns are detected in numbers, quantified, or whether they're descriptive patterns in their experiences.
Thanks.
Okay, I take a chance and thank you on the behalf of EARLI. You gave us a wonderful and very interesting keynote today. Thank you, Allyson.